Usually, people have the right to believe whatever they choose to believe. However, there's a profound exception to that rule when it comes to the oppressed. The oppressed must gain a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of their plight and condition in order to liberate ourselves. Because if our understandings are flawed, then all of our liberating remedies and strategies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. This is why those of us who know the truth must teach African proverb. We must teach the truth regardless of who it offends. Those among us who are insisting that our minds are being controlled and manipulated by the Willie Lynch slave syndrome are profoundly ignorant. A person would have to be profoundly ignorant of how true brainwashing is achieved to believe that silly myth. Because that feeble-minded premise presents what would in fact be the least effective and least plausible method used for controlling generations of millions of people. It's absolutely absurd because it's not how true brainwashing is achieved. True brainwashing requires a system that is being constantly reapplied and reinforced upon the minds of a targeted population in order to remain effective. If not, its effectiveness would lessen with each new generations. Likewise, if our collective mental state of wherein which many of us think and behave in ways that are against our own self-interest and instead in ways that serve the system of white supremacy, if it was caused by a slave syndrome, a procedure that was done to us during slavery, it would have been lesser. It would have been greater upon our ancestors and it would have been lessened as we move further away from the era of slavery. But this isn't the case at all. We've in fact worsened. Case, point, and proof. During the 1960s, we called ourselves brothers and sisters. Now we're calling ourselves by the N word and the B word. We proudly wore our afros and our cornrows. Today, we're shamefully concealing our natural hair beneath European weaves. We also knew that white oppressive forces were in fact our worst enemies. Today, many of us are insisting that we're our own worst enemies. During the 1960s, we all agreed that we came from Africa. Today, millions of us are insisting that we're not from Africa. Although millions of us have taken DNA analysis which has scientifically confirmed our African origin, we are in fact more confused about our identity than ever before. And during the 1960s, we implemented the most successful unified protests in U.S. history. Today, to the contrary, we are now more divided than any previous time in history. The fact that we're collectively worse today than we were during the 1960s is proof that our collective condition has nothing to do with slavery. If it was, it would have lessened with each new generation as we move further away from the era of slavery. But this isn't the case at all. It has worsened. The truth of our plight and condition is actually directly linked to the white society's monopoly over information that are fed into our minds. It's the truth of our plight and condition. The true reason why many of us now reveres our oppressors and perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies, in spite of such a brutally horrific history to the contrary, and the many other noted things that are against our own interests and that instead serve the system of white supremacy, is not due to a silly slave syndrome. It's the truth. It's because we have been socialized to think as we now do. Socialized is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over the information that the oppressed receives to control what the oppressed believes. More specifically, socialized is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over the information that are systematically and repetitively fed into the collective minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed to think and behave in ways that are beneficial to all oppressors. This isn't some feeble-minded conspiracy theory, as so many of you have been socialized to respond and to think. It's the absolute truth. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual retribution from the oppressed, have always socialized the minds of the oppressed to think in ways that prevents the oppressed from engaging in massive acts of retribution against the oppressors. Because while brutal empires, through their weaponry advantage of guns, cannons, and rifles, can invade, enslave, and brutalize a people for many centuries, they, however, cannot win those people's loyalty or sustain peace indefinitely unless the minds of those people have been socialized to think in ways that prevents the oppressed from rebelling. The oppressed always eventually rebels. And brutal empires never truly lead the oppressed to thinking on their own, because it always leads to unified rebellion among the oppressed against the oppressors. Why? Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions toward their oppressors will continue to grow until acts of massive rebellion become inevitable. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are held under long-term oppression. To prevent these acts of massive rebellion from happening, the oppressors always manipulates the minds of the oppressed. They've always socialized them. Therefore, the perceptions held by the oppressed are never truly their own. They're always a false perceptions beneficial to the oppressors that were shrewdly embedded into the minds of the oppressed by the oppressors without them even realizing it. This is the hidden reality of what white oppressive forces have done to the Black population. This is all possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving people certain information ever so often, and you can persuade an entire generation towards an implied objective. It doesn't matter if the information is untrue. Most people will act accordingly to the information because they've all been given the same disinformation. This is what oppressive forces have done to Black people. They've socialized us. Unlike at the conclusion of World War II, when the Jewish Holocaust came to an end, when the U.S. and the UN contributed massive financial support to rebuild and restore their lives, there was no moral obligation to do the same for we Africans. Although the African Holocaust lasted hundreds of years longer, resulted in millions of more deaths, and more greatly decimated the African culture. When slavery was abolished, the U.S., Great Britain, and many other white nations that benefited greatly from the brutal exploitation of Africa felt no moral obligation to do the same for Africans as what was done for the Jews. They instead focused on their own self-interest by socializing Africans. People that have been socialized rarely, if ever, learns of this fact. Now, the reasons for the noted changes within the African American culture between today and the 1960s is because in response to the 1960s unprecedented unified Black protests, it was determined by white oppressive forces that the African American culture had to be fundamentally changed from what it was during the 1960s. To meet that objective, white oppressive forces, white social scientists, and white propagandists deployed an ideological subversion system against the entire African American population. It's how white oppressive forces subdued the Black Power movement. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses disinformation, misinformation, and deception as a weapon to manipulate targeted populations to think in ways that are against their own interests. It fundamentally changes a culture. White oppressive forces have spread so much false disinformation into the Black community until virtually everything that we believe are lies that hinders our ability to unify and liberate ourselves. It confuses the Black community to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to any sensible conclusion in the interest of liberating ourselves from our oppression. This is why we are more confused now. They spread propaganda into our community. The purpose is to attack the targeted population at a psychological level in a bid to destabilize and undermine their entire culture. The ultimate goal is the complete collapse of the targeted population's culture. This is why we are in the state we are today. Welcome to the real world. Throughout generations, our ancestors have always provided us with those they've given the spiritual insight to see through the oppressor's maze of lies and confusion. Those of us that have been bestowed with this gift of insight must teach the truth, whether it fills the room or clears it out. We must post the truth, whether we're hated for it, berated for it, blocked for it, or unfriended for it. We must teach the truth regardless of the consequences and regardless of who it offends, because we are called to awaken the sleeping black sheep, not to entertain the blind, lost, and mentally enslaved goats. One love and peace.